In this section, we're going to be talking about license and ordination and some of the distinctives of our Foursquare family in Canada. So the purpose of licensing is important to understand, and I think it'll help a lot of people along the way if you understand why we license people and why we don't license other people. And the purpose of licensing is mainly to endorse those who have pastoral authority within the church. There are some other categories of licensing as well, but that's the main thing that we do, is endorse those who have pastoral authority within the church. It's important to separate this from the whole idea of clergy and laity within the church. So it's not to identify some people as clergy who do everything and the laity who sit back and watch. The whole idea of having kind of an audience and then the people who do everything is foreign to Foursquare. We love the verse in Ephesians chapter 4 that talks about apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers being given in order to prepare God's people for works of service. And the little tagline that flows out of that is that every member is a minister. We all have an important role to play in Jesus' ministry and in Jesus' mission in the world. So being licensed doesn't mean those are the only people that do the work. It just means they do one type of the work. So those mainly with pastoral authority. They're held to a higher standard within our organization because they have authority over larger groups of people. And they have a teaching authority usually too, and we want to make sure that we know them so that we know what they're teaching and that they're teaching what's in line with Foursquare beliefs. So teaching, pastoral authority are important there. And sometimes there's also the need for official requirements to be recognized by the government. We can only assign some people who will be performing marriages legally within our churches. And so those are people that fall under the category of being licensed. One of the things that licensing also does is it helps us to get to know the people who we're licensing. In 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 22, it says, do not be hasty in the laying on of hands, and do not share in the sins of others. Keep yourself pure. In other words, if you lay hands on people too quickly, giving them authority within the church, you can actually share in the mistakes that they make and the wrongs that they do because you've been too hasty in appointing them into positions of authority. And we don't want to do that. We want to know those who labor among us. We want to make sure that not only are they ready for it, but for their sakes, but also for the church's sake. Churches can suffer by having a leader who's not prepared, and the leader themselves can suffer by being put into a position that they're not quite ready for. So those are the things that we look for. We look for their spiritual life, their character, ministry experience, beliefs. In the license process, we also have people fill out a criminal record check just to make sure there's something that we don't know about them. We have them fill out reference checks so that people that they know are able to speak about who they are, and those are sent anonymously into the national office to go along with a license application. So the whole thing is to get to know people, make sure they're ready for a role, and the role is a specific one of pastoral authority and teaching, plus a few other things. But what it doesn't mean is that people who aren't licensed don't have an important ministry within the church. That is not what it means. I guess another benefit of it is by getting licensed, you get placed into a system of accountability. By being appointed, you have someone who appoints you, who is your overseer, who then you're plugged into the system of accountability. And that's good for all of us. I like being accountable to someone. I'm accountable right now to our national board, our pastors, they're accountable to the supervisors and me. Everybody is accountable to someone, which is a really good, healthy way to be set up. Now, when you're talking about how we license people within the Foursquare family in Canada, there are some things that we do a bit differently than maybe some other denominations do. For one, and this was brought up earlier referring to women in ministry, there's some denominations that are reluctant or maybe don't even license women to be in ministry, but we do. We embrace, and not only embrace, but we encourage women to be in leadership at any level of the church. not just restricted to some levels or some ministries, but any leadership position in the church. Another one of our distinctives in the way that we do things is that we restrict the use of the title pastor, or at least we try to people who have been vetted by the license committee. Now, I know that there's cultures that are out there and there's people coming from different parts of the world, and I've lived in parts of the world where titles are really important. And to not give someone an honorary title when you speak to them feels disrespectful. I've been places in India where if they don't know who I am, just because I'm older, they call me uncle, because you got to use a title of respect somehow. So uncle, uncle. And pastor is one of those titles of respect. If you're working with the church, people just want to use it. But my request, and I think our request as a Foursquare family, is that within our Foursquare churches, that you reserve the use of the title pastor for those who have been vetted, that are known by the license committee, and it's been confirmed that they are ready to serve in those positions, and that they are in general alignment with who we are as a Foursquare family in Canada. Otherwise, you could have a new person come into church and you're talking about, oh, Pastor Jones, and they're not really a licensed pastor, but a new person thinks, well, they must be. Maybe they're even the pastor of this church. And it can be confusing for people who are within the church that don't know what's going on. So just request that we reserve that for those who have been licensed within Foursquare Canada. Another one of the things that we do that is a little bit distinctive from some denominations is that we only license people while they're under appointment. Some denominations take the approach that you get licensed in advance and that makes you eligible for an appointment. And it's possible to be licensed with several different organizations at the same time without actually having a position in ministry. We don't take that stance. Our stance is that you are licensed while you're in that position of ministry. And there's some reasons for this, the reason that it works within our system. One is that people who are licensed have a vote at our annual general meeting. And if you have people who are licensed but don't have any active part in the family, you're kind of wondering, well, who might they represent with that vote? So anyway, that's the way that we do it, is we license people who are under appointment, not just ministers at large, who may be qualified to be a pastor but aren't necessarily one right now or in a role of ministry. Another thing that goes along with that is a requirement of getting licensed with Foursquare Canada is that you surrender any other credentials you have with another organization. So if you've been organized or you've been licensed with another denomination, when you become licensed with Foursquare, you have to surrender those prior credentials. If you finish your term of service with Foursquare, wherever that happens to be, we're happy for you to go back to that organization and be relicensed. There's no purpose in trying to say we're right and other people are wrong. It's more a sense of, we see licensing connected with accountability. And it's hard to be accountable to more than one head at the same time, isn't it? And so by being licensed only with Foursquare Canada, that's who a minister is accountable to, not to some other organization. So we do limit it to people who are, or we do ask that people surrender other licenses while they serve within Foursquare Canada. Another kind of a unique thing that is true of the family in Foursquare Canada, it's actually not even true of all Foursquare churches across the world, but within Canada this is true, that ordination happens when a person is first licensed. They happen concurrently with the first licensing of a person. Now this is different than some other organizations and used to be different of us. We used to have a gap of time between when a person was licensed, and then after they have proven ministry after 2 or 3 years, then they could be ordained and they would get a separate certificate of ordination. But a discussion came up in the mid-90s about how biblical this was. Did they lay on hands on people after 3 years, or did they lay on hands when they sent them out? And we decided it actually seems more biblical if we ordain them. We say we trust them when they're sent, not after they've been out there for 2 or 3 years. We respect other systems, but that was more the stance that we took. And so when a person is licensed for the first time, they're given a certificate of license and ordination. Now, in subsequent positions within Foursquare Canada, they don't get a new certificate every time around, but they do get hands laid on them in subsequent appointments that they might be within. Another one of the things that's kind of distinctive about the way that we do things is that we don't require that someone has a formal degree before we're willing to license them and appoint them. I know some denominations where you have to have a Master of Divinity before you're qualified to become a pastor. Some require other degrees, but we don't. And it's not that we don't value education, but there's things that we see in the mix that are also really important about a person. How spiritually mature are they? What kind of ministry experience do they have? What's their character like? Do their giftings fit the position that they're going to be appointed to? It's kind of like if you've got all those bases covered, you can educate a person who's gifted and has godly character and has all of the capabilities to serve in that position. You can educate them later. And in fact, there's a benefit to educating people in service. You're more motivated to learn when whatever you're learning is immediately applied. Have you ever figured that out? Like right now, I could do a course on how to change a transmission out in a Honda Civic, and it'd be really hard to remember what to do. But I've changed my brakes on my car, and so I go into YouTube and I kind of study how you're meant to do it because I bought the parts and I'm going to do it. It's about to happen, so it's important for me that I get this right. I want to be able to stop when I leave the house and want to make sure that everything's working well. So as I'm studying, I'm really interested, and I'm really retaining everything that I'm learning because there's going to be immediate application. So when you get people who are in service training and they're immediately applying the learning or the skills or whatever it is that's part of their training process, they're highly motivated to learn. One time when I was training someone who is already involved in pastoral ministry, we did a course on cults. And they happened to live in a community that had a lot of Mormons within the community. And he came to me the next day and he's like, this has been so helpful. And, I was in a conversation just yesterday and we were talking about all the stuff that we studied in class. That all came up and I got to answer questions. And so he was so motivated to learn because he was immediately applying it to the situation at hand. So it's a great value to in-service training, which is really what the FMD is all about. Okay. Formal degrees, we don't require them. It's not that we don't think that they're important, though. And so there is a 32 base credits that we want people to do. If people can do further degrees, we would encourage that. There's ways of helping to subsidize that, all the way up to doing master's degrees in seminary. So we're not anti-education by any means. We just see that there are other pathways to be in effective and fruitful pastoral ministry. Another thing that we do is we require licenses to be renewed annually. Technically, your license or a pastoral license expires December 31st every year and has to be renewed again. And part of that process, it helps us to check up on some things. One of the things that's a requirement is that you have to do an annual interview with your supervisor before you're relicensed. And you have to sign off again on our ethical statement, the statement of pastoral ethics, which is in the appendix as well. And so it reminds you of the things that you are committing yourself to ethically, but the whole relational thing of sitting down with your overseer and going through a list of topics. And just to let you know, this isn't a performance review. It isn't, well, how much did you grow the church by? What's the church budget doing? It isn't those kind of things. It's more like going to your doctor and getting a checkup. Hey, how are you doing? How's this area of your life doing? We even ask things like, are you sleeping well at night? All of those kind of things are brought up because we want to know that you're doing okay. And if you're not doing okay, we want to help out somehow because we really want to see our pastors do well. And that's the whole purpose of this, what we call a spiritual and emotional inventory, this interview that takes place with your supervisor every year. So that whole renewal process serves a number of different purposes in the way that we do things. But that is one of the distinct items of how we do licensing. Another kind of a distinctive is that in licensing, we limit licenses to having 2 licenses in a church for the first 50 people in regular attendance at your main meetings, which is usually Sunday. And then you can have 1 more license position for every 50 people beyond that. So if you've got 49 people in your church, you can still have 2 people that are licensed within the church. And then that, the number increases depending on what your size is. It's kind of, as you guess, there's a reason that we have some of these limits in place. And there was some situations where we had small churches with many licensed people, and that wasn't very helpful, both, again, for the whole AGM thing where they have a vote, and not only do they have a vote, but they count towards the number that we need for quorum at the AGM, which is a legal requirement, and that creates a headache if there's too many people who aren't coming to convention. Anyway, there's good reasons for it, but one of the other reasons is that we don't want licenses to be handed out more as a reward, like, okay, you're doing a good job, let's get you licensed, or to become something that kind of signifies a separation between clergy and laity. Oh yeah, you're part of the ministry team of the church, so you should be licensed. We don't want that. That's not the whole purpose of licensing, and so that's why some of those limitations are put in there. The number of licenses under a church doesn't count some categories for ministries outside the church. Like if you're a chaplain for a parachurch organization, you can be licensed through FOURSQUARE under your church, but you don't, that number doesn't count towards the limit that a church can have. Missionaries, things like that would also fit under that category. So licensing 2 for the first 50. So licensing is a process that begins with a prospective minister's form, which can be found on our website. Should only take probably 15 to 30 minutes to fill out. And there's a purpose for this form in the order that we do the licensing. The form asks a lot of questions on paper about who a person is. And I often learn about a person on paper before I even meet them in person. The kind of idea is if they really aren't a fit for FOURSQUARE, we don't want them to go through a whole process of application and interviews and references just to be told no. If they're clearly not a fit, this is the point where we need to say, hey, you're either not ready or you're really not a fit for the FOURSQUARE family. So a person would fill out the prospective minister's form. We find some background information. Do they even have citizenship in Canada? When did they get saved? Have they been baptized in water? Are they a member of a church? Have they been filled with the Holy Spirit? What are their gifts and their interests? Do they have an understanding of what their ministry gifts might be? What is their ministry experiences? What have they done? One of the ones that I've come across a couple times is there's a question, have you prayed for a person to be healed? And when that box isn't checked, I kind of scratch my head. We believe in Jesus, our healer. I didn't ask if you healed somebody. It's just asked, have you ever prayed for somebody to be healed? And when they haven't, and yet they want to be licensed into ministry, it's probably a good reason to have a discussion before you move on from that point. See, well, why haven't you at least prayed for someone? So there's some of those questions that just flag discussions or flag things that could be a concern and show that they might not fit. We ask about what their education is, not because they have to have a degree, but because we want to know what influences have you had in your life. Also want to know what books they've been reading and what preachers they've been listening to, because that also shows something about the influences that they have within their life. We just want to get to know them as much as we can at this stage of the process. And then there's a list of belief statements, which is clearly labeled, not all of these are FOURSQUARE beliefs. Check off the ones that you agree with. So every year we have at least one of these comes in where somebody just checks all the boxes because they just think that's what you want to hear and they send it in. And of course we send it back and say, hey, you did it wrong. And either if you believe all that stuff, then you're not a fit, or you just didn't care and you checked all the boxes to finish your form. But there's things that get flagged sometimes for discussion, things that we talked about today. Do you believe that Salvation can never be lost or forfeited. Believe that a person must hear the gospel to be saved. And one of the reasons that's in there is there's an idea out there that as long as you're kind of responding to God in whatever light that you have, that you can be saved under the cross without ever hearing the gospel. And that's kind of foreign to when you put together the truths of the Bible. So we want to know whether they think something like that. Some people overthink some of these statements too, and they're like, oh, I can't answer that. Like, what if a person can't hear? Like, they're deaf. How could they hear the gospel? And so they have to write all these little comments. Sometimes it just needs a conversation that clarifies some of the things that people are thinking and believing. Another one that comes up every once in a while has to do with, is a person born again when they are baptized in water? And we get people checking yes. Well, there's a scripture that you could confuse with saying that, but actually baptism is an outward sign of what's already happened to you. And so that also triggers another conversation. Before we move on from here, we want to understand how you understand salvation to take place, because there is this idea of baptismal regeneration that has floated around in church history, and we want to make sure that's not something that people believe. So that whole prospective ministers form gets filled in, and then it gets submitted, and myself and the unit supervisor have a look through it. And then we have a little conversation about the person if they're being considered for a position of ministry. Do you think they're ready to go on to application? Do we need to have any conversations with them first? And if there's a conversation, I usually ask the supervisor to do that, and they carry out the conversation and let me know how that went. But if everything looks okay, then we ask the national office to send them the most recent license application, because like most of our forms and documents, the website or the national office can give you the most recent version, not the version that is already outdated. And so they get that, and what goes along with that is a discussion guide. The discussion guide takes you through our declaration of faith with some questions that goes along with it. And whoever your direct overseer is goes through those questions with you to make sure that you understand what Foursquare believes and maybe clarify some of the things that you believe. And then you fill out the rest of the application along with your references and everything else. Once those are filled out, it gets submitted into the national office. So let's just review this process. Say you're a lead pastor and you want to license a youth pastor. So the first thing that you do is you need to talk to your church council, because you can't appoint a youth pastor without your church council being in approval. If they're in approval, say the youth pastor's name is Bob. Well, you say, hey, Bob, you got to go on foursquare.ca and you got to fill out a prospective ministers form. So then Bob does that. He fills out his prospective ministers form. It gets forwarded on to me and the supervisor. We have a talk, say, hey, we think Bob could be a good fit. Let's move him on in the licensing process. Get one of the people from the national office to send him an application packet. So now you as the lead pastor, you have to go through the discussion guide questions to make sure that they understand what Foursquare believes and that we understand what Bob believes as well. So once that takes place, make sure that all the pieces of the application are together, that they've got the criminal record check, which includes vulnerable sector, and it's not an old one. It can't be 5 years old. It's got to be a current one. Get all these references in place. All that stuff, when it's all ready, gets to the national office. And as long as you get it in 2 weeks before one of our licensing meetings, then the application will be considered at that meeting. And we have license meetings in usually late January or very beginning of February. Also either late April or May, depending on when our convention is, and in September. That's when the License and Ordination Committee sits. License and Ordination Committee is made up of the supervisors, myself, and the president of PLBC. And we go through the applications and make a decision. And the decision will either be yes, approved, or it could be approved with a condition. Maybe there's something they hadn't sent in any transcripts, which is one of the requirements. So subject to receiving transcripts, or it may be tabled. If there's a more serious situation, we might want to see some change take place, or we might want something clarified. So it'll be tabled till the next meeting, or it may not be approved. Just say, yeah, we really don't think this person is either ready or is a fit for Foursquare. So those are the decisions that get made. That's really the process. And once, say they get approved, then you as the lead pastor who wanting to appoint Bob, you get notified by your unit supervisor, hey, they've been approved, and the national office issues the license and ordination certificate, and you get a chance to install Bob officially as a youth pastor in your church. Now, licenses can or may be revoked. They may be transferred between positions, and they can also be reactivated if they have ceased to continue. So before a license is revoked, it's usually a fairly serious situation that's gone on. And the president, the national board, the unit supervisor, and the church council all get involved before anything final is done. If it's not a clear-cut type of a situation, the national board could also strike an ethics committee to look into it and to determine more about what's happening in that situation. We hope that that never happens, but it is a possibility. Licenses can also be transferred between positions. Now, there's two different types of licenses within Foursquare Canada. We have a national license and we have a staff license. It has nothing to do with importance. It has to do with what your lines of accountability are. National licenses have lines of accountability into the national church. So lead pastors are national licenses because their lines of accountability go to the supervisor and myself. A staff license would be directly accountable to their local church lead pastor. So Bob, the youth pastor, he would have a staff license because his direct accountability would be to the lead pastor. So it has to do with where your accountability lies. Those are the two different types of licenses. So if you want to transfer a license, if you're transferring from a staff position to a new staff position, you don't have to be relicensed for that. Or from a lead position to another lead position, you don't have to be relicensed for that. The only thing that we do, either if you're going from a lead position to a new lead position, or you're going from a staff position to a lead position, is one thing that we do is we review your FMD courses. So if you have been required, out of those 32 credits, maybe there's 5 courses that were flagged to say, hey, they didn't cover these topics anywhere else. We want to make sure that they do these 5 courses. You are expected to complete one of those every year. And if you haven't, we may delay the change until you can catch up and make sure that you've completed those things. Another thing, if you're going into a lead pastor position, is you'll be asked to do one of those exams on the administrative manual, which might sound intimidating, but exam means a multiple choice open book thing. You can look up the answers in the admin manual. The whole purpose of it is, I found out that some of our pastors never looked in the admin manual. And so the purpose of it is to make sure you know what the administrative manual is and you know how to find something in there. At least, dip your toe in the water. And so if you're looking for answers, you'll know where you can find a resource for that. Sometimes, too, we do just a doctrinal review. If it's been a long time since they were first licensed, we might go through some of those questions. But otherwise, they can be transferred from person to person, or from position to position. The other thing, say a person finishes a position in September, we usually leave their license active till the end of that calendar year. It's easier with all of the processes that are involved. And if you leave a position and your license lapses, and maybe 2 years later, you're appointed into a new position that's a licensable position, then your license can be reactivated without going through the whole process. But if it's over 3 years, 3 years is the cutoff, because we think after 3 years, maybe enough has changed that we need to make sure we take another look at you. But if it's under 3 years, there's a possibility that it could be reactivated. So that's just a brief overview of licensing and ordination in the Foursquare Gospel Church of Canada.